The tension in Washington had been building for weeks. Anyone walking through the halls of Congress could feel it, that unmistakable electricity in the air before a political storm. Reporters huddled in corners, whispering about the upcoming hearing that everyone knew would be different from the usual political theater. Karoline Leavitt sat in her office late into the evening, surrounded by stacks of documents, highlighted papers, and 3 empty coffee cups. The young Republican spokesperson had earned a reputation for her direct communication style and unwavering confidence, but even she knew this upcoming Congressional Showdown required extra preparation. "You should get some rest," said her chief of staff, poking his head through the doorway. "Tomorrow's going to be a long day." Karoline looked up from her notes, tucking a strand of blonde hair behind her ear. "Just 1 more hour. There's something about Schiff's position on the defense budget that doesn't add up." Her team had compiled months of statements, votes and policy positions from Congressman Adam Schiff, analyzing every inconsistency and contradiction they could find. This wasn't personal for Karoline, it was about accountability. She believed deeply that elected officials should answer for their words and actions, especially when they changed their stance depending on which way the political winds blew. Across town, in a much larger office with a view of the Washington Monument, Adam Schiff reviewed his own briefing materials. The veteran Democratic congressman from California had weathered countless political battles throughout his career. With his team of seasoned advisors surrounding him, he projected nothing but confidence. "The committee hearing tomorrow is straightforward," Schiff told his staff, leaning back in his leather chair. "We stick to our talking points about national security interests, emphasize the importance of oversight, and remind everyone of the precedents we've established." One of his younger aides spoke up hesitantly. "Sir, Karoline Leavitt has been doing a lot of research. Our sources say she's been digging into your previous statements on similar issues." Schiff waved his hand dismissively. "She's inexperienced. These young GOP firebrands always come in thinking they can score points with gotcha moments. I've been doing this since before she was in college." What Schiff didn't realize was that underestimating Karoline Leavitt would prove to be his first mistake. The morning of the hearing arrived with the kind of clear, crisp autumn day that made Washington look like it deserved to be the capital of a great nation. News vans lined the streets around the Capitol building, and social media was already buzzing with anticipation. What was officially scheduled as a routine oversight hearing on defense appropriations had somehow transformed into the political equivalent of a heavyweight match. Karoline arrived early, walking through the nearly empty committee room to get a feel for the space. She'd testified in similar rooms before, but never with stakes this high. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from colleagues offering encouragement or last-minute advice. The GOP leadership had initially been hesitant about putting someone relatively new in such a high-profile position, but Karoline's detailed knowledge of the issues had won them over. She walked to the witness table and placed her hand on the surface, feeling the smooth wood beneath her fingers. In 4 hours, this room would be packed with committee members, staffers, journalists, and C-SPAN cameras capturing every word, every reaction, every subtle shift in body language. "Getting a feel for the battlefield?" asked a friendly voice behind her. Karoline turned to see Congressman Tom Wilson, a senior Republican on the committee. He had been one of her earliest supporters on Capitol Hill. "Just trying to quiet the butterflies," she admitted with a small smile. "You'll do fine," Wilson said, his voice carrying the slight drawl of his southern district. "Just remember, he's used to people backing down when he starts throwing around his seniority and position. Don't let him rattle you." "I won't," Karoline promised, straightening her shoulders. "This isn't about me versus him anyway. It's about the facts," Wilson chuckled. "In theory, yes. But in that room, how you present the facts matters almost as much as the facts themselves." As the morning progressed, the empty halls began filling with the usual Capitol crowd, hurried staffers clutching folders, lobbyists in expensive suits making last-minute calls, tourists trying to navigate the building's confusing layout. For them, it was just another day in Washington. They had no idea they would soon witness a hearing that would dominate news cycles for days. By noon, Schiff and his team had set up in one of the small preparation rooms near the committee chamber. The congressman projected calm authority as he reviewed his opening statement one last time. "Remember, we're focusing on the broader issues here," he instructed his aides. "If Leavitt tries to bring up unrelated matters, I'll redirect to the actual purpose of this hearing." His communications director nodded. We've prepared responses for the most likely lines of attack. The chair will almost certainly give you extra time for rebuttals if needed. Schiff had spent years cultivating relationships with committee chairs from both parties. Those relationships had served him well, allowing him more flexibility than junior members typically received. Meanwhile, outside the hearing room, the crowd had grown so large that Capitol Police had to establish a line for those hoping to get a seat in the public gallery. Political junkies, college students, and even some tourists who had heard about the upcoming confrontation waited patiently for the doors to open. I heard Leavitt has something big on. Schiff, one congressional intern whispered to another, as they held places in line for their bosses. Schiff's too smart to get caught off guard, her friend replied. He's been playing this game since Leavitt was in high school. Inside the committee anteroom, Karoline finished a quick lunch while her team gave her a final briefing. Her press secretary ran through likely questions from journalists after the hearing, while her policy advisor reminded her of key numbers she should have ready. Remember, you don't need to swing for the fences on every exchange, her chief of staff advised. Build your case methodically. The big moments will come naturally if you lay the groundwork. Karoline nodded, feeling surprisingly calm now that the moment was almost here. She had spent countless hours preparing for this day, not just in the past weeks but throughout her career. Growing up in a small New Hampshire town, she had developed a thick skin and learned how to stand her ground. Those qualities had served her well as she rose through Republican communications roles to her current position. At precisely 2 p.m., the committee chair called the hearing to order. The room fell silent as camera shutters clicked and microphones were adjusted. The audience watched as committee members made their opening statements, most sticking to predictable partisan talking points about government spending and national security priorities. When it was Schiff's turn to speak, he leaned into the microphone with the ease of someone who had done this hundreds of times before. His opening statement was polished and delivered with the perfect balance of gravity and authority. He spoke about American leadership in the world, the importance of military readiness, and his concerns about certain budget allocations. Several Republican committee members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Schiff was good, they all knew it. He knew how to frame issues in ways that made his position sound reasonable and opposition seem extreme. He knew when to appeal to patriotism and when to cite obscure precedents that few could challenge on the spot. When he finished, there was a murmur of appreciation from the Democratic side of the committee. The chairman then introduced Karoline as the Republican spokesperson presenting the minority position. As she took her place at the witness table, Karoline felt a moment of clarity. The nerves that had followed her all morning suddenly vanished. She had done her homework. She knew exactly what needed to be said and how to say it. Most importantly, she knew that behind Schiff's confident facade were contradictions and policy reversals that needed to be addressed. She adjusted her microphone and began her statement, her voice clear and steady. Those watching closely might have noticed Adam Schiff's slight surprise at her opening approach. Instead of launching into partisan attacks or broad ideological statements, Karoline began by methodically outlining areas where there was genuine bipartisan agreement on defense matters. This wasn't the firebrand they had expected. This was someone establishing common ground before identifying specific disagreements, a strategy that made it harder to dismiss her as merely partisan committee members who had been checking their phones or reviewing notes now looked up, paying closer attention. Even some journalists in the press section, who had been preparing to file fairly standard stories about partisan bickering, began taking more detailed notes. Nobody in that room yet realized they were witnessing just the opening moves of what would become one of the most talked-about congressional exchanges of the year. The real confrontation was still to come. But the stage was now set for a political showdown that would reshape public perception of both Karoline Leavitt and Adam Schiff. As Karoline continued her opening statement, her eyes briefly met Schiff's across the room. In that moment, something passed between them, a silent acknowledgement that this would not be business as usual. The congressman shifted slightly in his seat, reaching for his water glass. For the first time that day, he looked just a little less certain of himself. The committee room hummed with anticipation as Karoline finished her opening statement. She had carefully laid the groundwork without showing her full hand. Now came the moment when the real exchange would begin. The committee chairman cleared his throat and announced the start of questioning. Congressman Schiff, you have 15 minutes, the chairman said, nodding toward the California representative. Schiff straightened his tie and leaned toward his microphone. His reputation as a skilled questioner was well earned. Over the years, he had dismantled the arguments of many witnesses who came before his committees, using a combination of legal precision and theatrical timing that played well on camera. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Schiff began, his voice carrying the practiced cadence of someone comfortable in the spotlight. Ms. Leavitt, I appreciated your opening statement, though I noticed several points that seemed to misrepresent both historical precedent and current policy. He shuffled through his papers with deliberate slowness, a tactic Karoline recognized immediately. It was meant to create unease, to make the witness wonder which of their statements was about to be challenged. Let's start with your assertion about defense spending priorities, Schiff continued. You stated that the current administration has reduced funding for frontline combat units while increasing spending on what you termed administrative overhead. Could you provide specific examples of this alleged shift in priorities? It was a good opening move. Ask for specifics, make the witness do the work, then pick apart any weak points in their response. Karoline had anticipated this exact approach. Certainly, Congressman, she replied, not reaching for her notes. She had memorized these figures, knowing they would likely be the first point of contention. In the last budget cycle, funding for combat training was reduced by 12.3% compared to the previous year, while administrative office expenses across the Pentagon increased by 8.7%. More specifically, the line item for field exercises for Army combat units saw a $340 million reduction, while spending on new administrative position creation rose by $418 million. Karoline paused briefly, then added, "These figures come directly from the budget document submitted by the Department of Defense, which I'd be happy to enter into the record." Several committee members looked up from their phones. Specific numbers always got attention, especially when delivered without hesitation. A couple of staffers behind Schiff hurriedly checked their own documents. Schiff barely missed a beat. Those numbers lack important context, Ms. Leavitt. The reduction in training expenses reflected the drawdown of certain overseas operations, while the administrative increases largely represent cybersecurity enhancements that were categorized under administrative functions but directly support combat readiness. That's an interesting interpretation. Congressman, Karoline replied, her tone remaining respectful but firm. However, the budget justification document specifically separated cybersecurity enhancements into their own category, which saw a commendable increase of 23% that I fully support. The administrative increases I referenced were explicitly for non-cybersecurity positions, primarily in the Office of the Secretary of Defense and various Deputy Assistant Secretary offices. A slight furrow appeared on Schiff's brow. He hadn't expected her to have such command of the budget subcategories. Most witnesses would have accepted his explanation rather than challenge it directly. Let's move on, Schiff said, shifting papers again. You made several claims about readiness assessments that contradict testimony we received just last month from the Joint Chiefs. Are you suggesting that our military leadership is providing inaccurate information to Congress? It was a trap question, designed to force Karoline into either backing down or appearing to attack military leadership. The room grew quieter as people leaned forward, waiting for her response. Not at all, Congressman, Karoline said. In fact, I have the greatest respect for our military leadership. What I am pointing out is a discrepancy between the public testimony and the written readiness report submitted to the Armed Services Committee, particularly regarding maintenance backlogs for key equipment systems. She reached for a folder and extracted a single page, holding it up. I have here the readiness assessment submitted in writing on March 18th, which states that maintenance backlogs for the F-35 fleet have increased by 37% over the past year. Yet in public testimony on April 23rd, it was stated that maintenance issues were largely resolved. Both statements cannot be simultaneously accurate. A Republican committee member nodded appreciatively. Schiff's Democratic colleagues exchanged glances. This wasn't going according to the expected script. Schiff took a sip of water, buying himself a moment to think. Ms. Leavitt, complex military systems often see fluctuations in readiness. A report from March and testimony from April could reflect real improvements made in that time period. Karoline was ready for this. That would be a reasonable explanation, Congressman, except for one thing. She held up another document. The written update submitted to this very committee just 3 days after that testimony acknowledged that the backlog remained at 34% above baseline levels. So the improvement suggested in the public testimony doesn't align with the military's own written updates. Whispers rippled through the room. Journalists began typing furiously on their laptops. This was no longer routine committee theater. This was becoming a genuine confrontation backed by specifics. Schiff's expression darkened slightly. He had not expected to be on the defensive so early in the exchange. Ms. Leavitt, cherry-picking statistics without understanding the full operational picture can lead to misunderstandings. There are classification issues that limit what can be discussed in open settings. I completely agree about the importance of protecting classified information, Congressman, Karoline responded smoothly. However, all the documents I've referenced are unclassified and publicly available through the committee's own records. I'm simply pointing out inconsistencies in publicly released information. A photographer captured the moment perfectly, Karoline looking directly at Schiff, completely composed, while the congressman shuffled through papers with a slight frown. The image would appear on several news websites within the hour. Schiff decided to change tactics. Let's discuss your criticism of the administration's diplomatic approach to the Pacific region. You've made some rather bold claims about the effectiveness of our current strategy. I have indeed, Karoline acknowledged, and I base those assessments on outcomes rather than intentions. When this administration took office, we had strong working relationships with 8 of the 10 ASEAN nations. Current diplomatic assessments, including those from the State Department's own regional bureau, indicate we now have strained relationships with 4 of those 8 nations. She paused, then added, I believe we both agree that American leadership in the Pacific is crucial. My concern is not with the goal, but with the results of the current approach. Schiff leaned forward. Ms. Leavitt, foreign policy is complex and multifaceted. Relationships between nations ebb and flow based on numerous factors, many outside our direct control. To suggest that temporary diplomatic tensions represent a failure of strategy shows a rather simplistic understanding of international relations. It was a standard response. Appeal to complexity, suggest the critic lacks sophistication, but Karoline had anticipated this move as well. Congressman, with all due respect, I'm not referencing temporary tensions. I'm referencing specific policy outcomes. She opened another folder. For example, the joint naval exercises that had been conducted annually for 2 decades with our allies in the region have been reduced from 12 participating nations to just 7 in the past year. The mutual defense technology sharing agreements have seen 3 nations opt out of renewal, and direct foreign investment from these nations into joint security projects has declined by 43%. She closed the folder gently. These aren't matters of opinion or temporary diplomatic spats. These are measurable outcomes that directly impact our security posture in one of the most strategically important regions in the world. The room had grown unusually quiet. Even some Democratic committee members were taking notes now. Schiff's usual command of such exchanges seemed to be slipping as Karoline continued to counter with specific facts rather than partisan talking points. A junior congressman sitting near, Schiff slid a note in front of him. Schiff glanced at it briefly, then adjusted his approach. Ms. Leavitt, rather than trading statistics, let me ask you directly. What specifically would you have done differently regarding our Pacific partnerships? It was a good pivot. Move from defense to making the critic propose alternatives that could then be attacked. But again, Karoline was prepared. I would have maintained the regional security dialogue that was abandoned in June of last year, which gave smaller nations a meaningful voice in regional security planning. She answered without hesitation. I would have honored the missile defense commitments that were scaled back in September, and I would have responded more forcefully to the shipping lane provocations that occurred in the South China Sea, which caused 3 of our allies to question our commitment to regional stability. She leaned slightly forward. Each of these decisions had bipartisan opposition at the time they were made, Congressman. This isn't about party politics, it's about strategic consistency and honoring commitments to our allies. The chairman glanced at his watch. The gentleman from California has 3 minutes remaining. Schiff nodded, aware that the exchange wasn't going as planned. He had expected to easily outmaneuver a younger spokesperson with less experience. Instead, he found himself responding to her points rather than controlling the narrative. Ms. Leavitt, throughout your testimony, you've painted a picture of decline and failure that simply doesn't match reality, Schiff said, his voice taking on a slightly dismissive tone. The fact is, America's standing in the world remains strong. Our military remains the most powerful on Earth, and our diplomatic efforts continue to advance our interests globally. It was a broad statement, designed to rise above the specifics and appeal to patriotic sentiment. Several of his colleagues nodded in agreement. Karoline responded with a smile that conveyed both respect and disagreement. Congressman, I share your pride in America's strength and capability. Where we differ is not in our love for this country or our desire to see it secure and prosperous. We differ in our assessment of whether the current approaches are achieving those shared goals. Her voice took on a note of genuine conviction. I believe we can do better. I believe the American people deserve complete transparency about the challenges we face. And I believe that acknowledging problems is the first step toward solving them. As the chairman announced that Schiff's time had expired, many in the room realized they had just witnessed something unusual. A substantive exchange where specific facts took center stage over partisan rhetoric. The initial round had gone to Karoline, but everyone knew that Schiff would return for a second round of questioning later in the hearing. The real confrontation was yet to come. The committee took a 15-minute recess after the first round of questioning. In the hallway outside, journalists huddled around their phones, sending updates to their editors. The initial exchanges between Leavitt and Schiff had already generated buzz on social media, with clips spreading rapidly across various platforms. Inside a small side room, Karoline sipped water as her team gathered around her. The mood was cautiously optimistic, but they all knew the hardest part was still to come. He's going to change tactics when we go back in, her chief of staff warned, scrolling through his tablet. I'm seeing messages that his team is pulling additional files. They're looking for something to throw you off balance. Karoline nodded. I expected that. He's not used to being challenged with specifics. He'll try to broaden the scope, maybe bring up unrelated issues to regain control. Across the hallway, in a larger room, Schiff was having an intense conversation with his senior advisors. The congressman's usual calm demeanor had given way to visible frustration. How does she have those readiness figures? He demanded. Those reports were only circulated to committee members. His legislative director cleared his throat. They were entered into the public record last month, Congressman. Her team must have gone through the archives. Find me something she's gotten wrong, Schiff insisted. Everyone makes mistakes. There must be a statement, a figure, something we can use to undermine her credibility. As staffers hurried to comply, Schiff stared out the window at the Capitol grounds. He had faced countless opponents across committee tables over the years, but few had come so thoroughly prepared. It was unsettling. When the hearing resumed, the energy in the room had changed. Staffers who had been half paying attention during the early exchanges now sat alert. Additional journalists had somehow squeezed into the already crowded press section. Even the public gallery seemed fuller, as word spread through the Capitol that something unexpected was happening. The chairman recognized a junior Democratic congressman for 5 minutes of questioning. The young representative, eager to support Schiff, immediately went on the attack. Ms. Leavitt, you've made several assertions about defense readiness that seem designed to paint a false picture of our military capabilities. Isn't it true that overall combat readiness has actually improved according to the Pentagon's quarterly assessment? Karoline didn't miss a beat. The Pentagon's top-line assessment does show a 2% improvement in overall readiness. However, that figure combines disparate categories. When broken down by service branch and unit type, we see improvements in Air Force strategic units and naval support operations. But concerning declines in Army ground combat units and Marine expeditionary forces, precisely the forces we would rely on in a conventional conflict scenario. The congressman, clearly not expecting such a detailed response, tried again. But you can't deny that the current administration has increased the overall defense budget. The total dollar amount has indeed increased, Karoline acknowledged. But when adjusted for inflation and examined by category, we see that weapons modernization and combat training have received smaller portions of that increased budget, while administrative overhead has grown significantly. In real terms, we're spending more but getting less combat capability. The young congressman looked toward Schiff, who merely shrugged slightly. This line of questioning wasn't working as hoped. After a few more exchanges, the chairman thanked him and moved on to a Republican member. The Republican congressman smiled at Karoline. Ms. Leavitt, could you expand on the readiness concerns you mentioned earlier? How severe are these maintenance backlogs in practical terms? It was a friendly question designed to give Karoline room to elaborate on points she had made earlier. She took the opportunity to provide additional context that strengthened her position, explaining how maintenance delays affected deployment schedules and training opportunities. As questioning continued, a pattern emerged. Democratic members attempted to challenge Karoline's assertions, but found themselves drawn into detailed policy discussions where her command of the facts gave her the upper hand. Republican members asked broader questions that allowed her to expand on her key points and build a comprehensive case for her position. Finally, the chairman announced, "The gentleman from California, Mr. Schiff, is recognized for his second round of questioning." 10 minutes, the room grew quiet again. Everyone could sense that this would be the real confrontation. Schiff had now had time to regroup and prepare a counterattack. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman," Schiff began, his voice carrying a hint of steel that hadn't been there before. "Ms. Leavitt, you've shared many statistics today, but I'm troubled by what appears to be a selective use of data to create a misleading narrative." He held up a document. "I have here the full readiness report you cited earlier, and while you correctly quoted certain figures, you failed to mention that the report explicitly states that, and I quote, 'Despite maintenance challenges, overall force readiness for core mission requirements remains at acceptable levels across all service branches.'" He looked at her expectantly. It was a good point, the kind of contextual omission that could undermine her credibility if she couldn't address it convincingly. "Congressman, I appreciate you raising that point," Karoline replied calmly. "The phrase acceptable levels is indeed in the report, and it's precisely the kind of bureaucratic language that often masks serious problems until they become crises. If you'll turn to page 47 of that same report, you'll find the specific readiness rates by unit type. For frontline infantry battalions, the current readiness rate is 72%, well below the stated goal of 85% that the Department of Defense has established as truly acceptable." Schiff flipped through the report, momentarily thrown off balance. She had not only anticipated his attack, but had a ready response that used his own evidence against him. He tried a different angle. "Let's discuss your criticism of diplomatic efforts in the Pacific region. You mentioned declining participation in joint exercises, but failed to note that these have been partially replaced by new bilateral security arrangements that many military experts consider more effective. Familiar with the bilateral arrangements you're referencing, Congressman," Karoline responded. "There are currently 4 such agreements in place. However, what's less frequently mentioned is that these arrangements involve significantly fewer joint training hours than the multilateral exercises they replaced. According to the Navy's own training records, total interoperability training hours have decreased by 28% under these new arrangements." She paused briefly. "Additionally, 3 of our most important regional allies have explicitly stated in diplomatic communications, which were published in the State Department's quarterly review, that they prefer the multilateral framework that was previously in place." Schiff's expression hardened. He hadn't expected her to have such specific knowledge of diplomatic communications. His team had clearly underestimated her preparation. "Ms. Leavitt," he said, his tone growing more combative, "you've repeatedly criticized current policies without acknowledging the failures of the previous administration. The diplomatic relationships you claim are deteriorating were already severely strained before the current administration took office. It was a classic political move. Shift blame to predecessors, but Karoline refused to be drawn into a partisan back and forth. "Congressman, I'm not here to defend or criticize any particular administration. I'm focused on the current state of our military readiness and diplomatic standing, because that's what affects our national security today. The American people deserve an honest assessment of where we stand now and what needs to be improved, regardless of who was in office when problems began." Her response earned approving nods from several committee members on both sides of the aisle. By refusing to engage in partisan finger-pointing, she had maintained her credibility as someone concerned with substance over politics. Schiff sensed he was losing ground. He decided to try a more aggressive approach. Ms. Leavitt, earlier you cited figures about administrative spending increases at the Pentagon, but those figures don't match the official budget documents submitted to Congress. Are you perhaps relying on misleading information provided by partisan think tanks rather than official sources? It was a direct challenge to her credibility, suggesting she was either careless or deliberately using unreliable information. The accusation hung in the air as committee members leaned forward waiting for her response. Karoline's expression remained calm, but those who knew her well could see a flash of determination in her eyes. She reached for a blue folder on the table in front of her. "Congressman, I appreciate the opportunity to address the source of my information," she said, her voice steady. "The figures I cited come directly from the Pentagon's own budget, justification documents submitted to the House Armed Services Committee on February 14th of this year." She opened the folder and held up a page. "This is page 236 of the official submission, showing the 8.7% increase in administrative overhead that I referenced earlier. And this," she held up another document, "is the committee staff analysis confirming these figures, which was distributed to all committee members, including yourself, on March 3rd. A murmur ran through the room. Schiff's attempt to question her sources had backfired completely. Not only were her figures accurate, but she had effectively implied that Schiff either hadn't read the materials provided to his own committee or was deliberately misrepresenting them. For the first time in the hearing, Schiff appeared genuinely flustered. He shuffled papers for a moment before responding. "The interpretation of these budget categories is more nuanced than you're suggesting," he said, but his usual confidence had diminished noticeably. "I agree that budgetary analysis requires nuance, Congressman," Karoline replied, "which is why I've been careful to cite specific line items rather than broad categories whenever possible. The American people deserve that level of precision when we're discussing how their tax dollars are spent." The chairman glanced at his watch. The gentleman has 2 minutes remaining. Schiff realized he needed to change tactics again. "Ms. Leavitt, throughout this hearing you've painted a picture of decline and failed leadership. Don't you think such rhetoric undermines public confidence in our institutions and plays into the hands of our adversaries?" It was an attempt to put her on the defensive by suggesting her criticism was somehow unpatriotic. But Karoline refused to take the bait. "Congressman, I believe what truly undermines public confidence is the gap between what officials say and what the facts show," she responded. "The American people are resilient and can handle the truth even when it's difficult. What they can't tolerate is being told everything is fine when their instincts and experiences tell them otherwise." She leaned forward slightly. "Our adversaries aren't empowered by honest debates like this. They're empowered when we fail to address our challenges because we're too busy pretending they don't exist." Her response drew an unexpected smattering of applause from the public gallery, quickly silenced by the chairman's gavel. But the impact was clear. Schiff's attempt to question her patriotism had completely failed. As Schiff's time expired, he leaned back in his chair with a look that combined frustration and grudging respect. He had entered the hearing expecting an easy win against a less experienced opponent. Instead, he had found himself repeatedly outmaneuvered by someone who had done her homework more thoroughly than he had. The confrontation wasn't over. Committee hearings rarely produce clear winners and losers in a single exchange. But as the chairman called a short recess before the next round of questioning, everyone in the room knew they had witnessed something remarkable. A rising political voice had gone toe-to-toe with a veteran congressman, and more than held her own, and the decisive moment was still to come. During the recess, the hallways outside the committee room buzzed with activity. Congressional staffers huddled in small groups speaking in hushed tones. Journalists were frantically calling their editors, revising the stories they had planned to write. What had been expected to be a routine hearing had transformed into something much more newsworthy. In the committee anteroom, Karoline stood by the window, taking a moment of quiet amid the chaos. Her chief of staff approached with a tablet in hand. "You're trending on social media," he said, showing her the screen. "Clips from the hearing are everywhere. The networks are already requesting interviews for their evening programs." Karoline took a small sip of water. "That's not why we're here," she reminded him. "We still have work to do inside that room." Across the hall, Schiff was having an intense conversation with his senior staff. His communications director looked worried as she scrolled through her phone. It's not good, Congressman, she admitted. The narrative is forming that she came better prepared and is winning the exchange. We need something decisive in this next round. Schiff nodded grimly. I think I have it. Pull the transcript from her Fox News interview last month. There's something there we can use. As staffers rushed to comply, a senior Democratic committee member entered the room. Adam, you need to be careful here, he warned. She's clearly done her homework. If you go too hard after her and she swats it away again, it's going to look worse. Schiff's jaw tightened. I've been in politics for decades. I'm not about to be outmaneuvered by someone half my age with a fraction of my experience. Trust me, I know what I'm doing. When the hearing resumed, the atmosphere in the room had changed yet again. The earlier feeling of surprise had given way to anticipation. Everyone sensed that something important was unfolding, a potential shifting of political fortunes playing out in real time. The chairman called the hearing back to order. Before we continue with questioning, I want to remind everyone in the gallery that expressions of approval or disapproval are not permitted. Now we'll proceed with Congressman Wilson for 5 minutes. The Republican congressman smiled as he addressed Karoline. Ms. Leavitt, you've provided us with specific information about readiness challenges and budget allocations. Could you tell us what you believe should be our top priorities for addressing these issues? It was a softball question, designed to give Karoline an opportunity to present her positive vision rather than just criticism. She used the time effectively, outlining practical steps that could improve military readiness and diplomatic standing, without requiring massive budget increases. Several more committee members took their turns, some hostile, others supportive. Throughout it all, Karoline maintained her composure, responding to each question with specific information rather than vague talking points. Even when challenged aggressively, she refused to be baited into personal attacks or partisan rhetoric. Finally, the chairman announced, for the final round of questioning, the gentleman from California, Mr. Schiff, is recognized for 10 minutes. The room fell silent as Schiff adjusted his microphone. His earlier frustration had been replaced by a cool determination. He had weathered political storms before and had no intention of being bested by a newcomer, no matter how well prepared. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Schiff began, his voice measured and controlled. Ms. Leavitt, throughout this hearing, you've presented yourself as an advocate for transparency and factual accuracy. You've criticized what you characterize as inconsistencies between private reports and public statements. He paused, letting his words hang in the air for a moment. Given your emphasis on consistency and transparency, I'd like to explore your own record in this regard. Karoline maintained her calm expression, but she recognized the shift in tone. This was no longer about policy disputes. Schiff was making this personal. Last month, during an interview on Fox News, you made several statements about diplomatic initiatives in Eastern Europe, Schiff continued. You stated, and I quote, "The current diplomatic approach has completely failed to deter aggressive actions in the region." He held up a document. Yet just 2 weeks before that interview, in a speech to the World Affairs Council, you acknowledged that diplomatic pressure had yielded some positive results in limiting escalation. Those statements seem directly contradictory. How do you explain this inconsistency in your own positions? A murmur ran through the committee room. It was a well-executed attack. Schiff had found what appeared to be a contradiction in her own statements and was using her emphasis on consistency against her. Several Democratic members leaned forward, sensing a potential turning point. Karoline took a moment before responding, her face revealing nothing. Those watching closely might have noticed her press aide tense up, unsure how she would handle this unexpected line of attack. Thank you for the question, Congressman, Karoline began, her voice steady. I appreciate the opportunity to address these statements and provide the full context. She reached for a thin red folder that had remained unopened throughout the hearing. This small action caught Schiff's attention. It suggested she had anticipated even this line of questioning. The Fox News interview you referenced was specifically discussing the situation in the Balkan region, particularly the tensions between Kosovo and Serbia, Karoline explained. My statement about diplomatic failure was specifically about that situation, where aggressive actions have indeed continued despite diplomatic efforts. She opened the red folder and removed a single sheet of paper. My speech to the World Affairs Council, on the other hand, was focused on Ukraine and the diplomatic efforts to contain Russian influence in that region. Those are the diplomatic efforts I described as having yielded some positive results in limiting escalation. Karoline looked directly at Schiff. These weren't contradictory statements, Congressman. They were assessments of two different diplomatic situations in two different parts of Eastern Europe. The full transcripts of both the interview and the speech make this context completely clear. She slid the paper across the table. This is the complete transcript of my Fox News interview, with the questions included. The interviewer specifically asked about the Balkans, not Eastern Europe generally. Schiff felt a chill run through him as he glanced at the transcript. He had been given only the isolated quote without the preceding question that established the Balkan context. His staff had either missed this critical context or deliberately omitted it, setting him up for a devastating counter. Before Schiff could respond, Karoline continued, her voice taking on a new level of conviction. Congressman, I believe this perfectly illustrates one of the central points I've been trying to make today. Context matters. Cherry-picking isolated statements without providing their full context can create the appearance of contradiction where none exists. The impact of the moment was immediate and visible. Democratic committee members who had been leaning forward in anticipation of a gotcha moment now sat back in their chairs. Republicans tried to hide their smiles. Journalists frantically typed on their laptops. Schiff, a skilled political operator, recognized immediately that his attack had not only failed, but backfired spectacularly. He had accused her of inconsistency, while himself taking her statements out of context, exactly what he had criticized her for allegedly doing with government reports. The full context is certainly important, Schiff acknowledged, trying to recover. But even within specific regional contexts, your assessments of diplomatic efforts seem to vary considerably depending on your audience. It was a weak follow-up, and everyone in the room knew it. Schiff was scrambling now, trying to salvage something from his failed attack. My assessments vary based on facts and outcomes, Congressman, not based on audience, Karoline responded calmly. I believe the American people deserve nuanced analysis that acknowledges both progress and challenges in our foreign policy, rather than sweeping generalizations that oversimplify complex situations. She closed the red folder gently. When diplomatic efforts succeed, I acknowledge those successes. When they fail, I acknowledge those failures. That's not inconsistency. It's honest assessment based on specific facts in specific contexts. The room had grown so quiet that the sound of papers shuffling seemed unnaturally loud. Everyone present recognized they were witnessing a defining moment, not just in this hearing, but potentially in the careers of both participants. Schiff, to his credit, recognized that continuing this line of attack would only dig a deeper hole. He pivoted to policy questions for his remaining time, but the damage had been done. The confident, commanding presence that had defined his committee performances for years had been shaken. As Schiff's time expired, the chairman announced, "We'll take a final 10-minute recess before closing statements." In the hallway outside, a veteran Washington reporter turned to a younger colleague. "Did you see what just happened in there?" The younger journalist nodded, still looking slightly stunned. She completely turned his attack around on him. I've been covering Congress for 3 years, and I've never seen Schiff caught flat-footed like that. I've been covering him for 15 years, the veteran replied, and neither have I. Inside the small anteroom, Karoline's team was jubilant but trying to maintain their professional demeanor. Her press secretary was already fielding text messages from journalists requesting interviews. How did you know? Her chief of staff asked quietly. How did you know he would bring up that Fox interview? Karoline smiled slightly. I didn't know for certain, but I know how these hearings work. When policy arguments fail, the next step is always to look for personal contradictions. So I brought the complete transcripts of every interview and speech I've given in the last 6 months, just in case. In the larger room across the hallway, the mood was somber. Schiff sat alone at a small table staring at the transcript Karoline had provided. I should have had the full context, he said, when his communications director entered the room. This makes us look amateurish. We pulled the quote from the news coverage, not the original transcript, she admitted. That was a mistake. I'm sorry, Congressman. The final moments of the hearing passed in a blur of closing statements and procedural formalities. As the chairman gavelled the session to a close, the room erupted into activity. Journalists rushed for the exits, eager to file their stories. Congressional staffers huddled in small groups, already analyzing what had transpired and its potential implications. Karoline gathered her notes methodically, maintaining her composed demeanor despite the chaos unfolding around her. Several committee members approached to shake her hand, including a few Democrats who offered grudging nods of respect for her performance. That was quite something, an older Republican congressman told her quietly. I've sat through hundreds of these hearings and I've rarely seen someone so thoroughly prepared. Karoline smiled. Thank you, Congressman. That means a lot coming from you. Across the room, Schiff was surrounded by his staff, their expressions tense as they spoke in hushed tones. The congressman's usual confident stride was noticeably absent as he gathered his papers and prepared to leave. A few reporters called questions to him, but for perhaps the first time in his congressional career, Adam Schiff declined to give impromptu comments after a hearing. As Karoline stepped into the hallway, she was immediately surrounded by a wall of cameras and microphones. The press corps, sensing a significant political moment, had assembled in force. Ms. Leavitt, how do you feel about your exchange with Congressman Schiff? A reporter called out. Were you surprised by his approach in the final round of questioning? Asked another. Karoline paused, gathering her thoughts before responding. When she spoke, her voice remained measured and professional. Today's hearing was about substance, not personality, she said. It was about ensuring that the American people have accurate information about our military readiness, our diplomatic standing, and the challenges we face as a nation. I came prepared to discuss facts and policy. That's what I did, and that's what I'll continue to do. A seasoned political reporter pressed further. But you clearly got the better of one of Washington's most experienced politicians. That's got to feel like a victory. This isn't about winning or losing, Karoline replied firmly. It's about accountability and transparency. The American people deserve representatives who will ask tough questions and demand honest answers, regardless of party affiliation. That's not a victory for me. It's how our system is supposed to work. Her response, refusing to gloat or frame the exchange in personal terms, only enhanced the impression she had made during the hearing. Even journalists who might have been skeptical of her politics couldn't help but be impressed by her professionalism. As Karoline and her team made their way through the Capitol corridors, her press secretary's phone buzzed constantly with notification alerts. It's exploding on social media, she reported. Clips from the hearing are everywhere. The moment when you turned his Fox News attack around on him already has over 1 million views. Karoline nodded but remained focused. Let's get back to the office. We need to prepare for the follow-up questions that will come from this. Meanwhile, in a quiet corner office away from the press, Schiff sat alone with his chief of staff, conducting a post-mortem of what had just happened. It was a miscalculation, Schiff admitted, rubbing his temples. We underestimated her preparation and overestimated our own. It won't happen again. His chief of staff looked at his phone. The White House has called twice. They want to know what happened in there.